So as our video showed, and if you've been tracking with us for the past few weeks or so, we've been looking at the Gospel of Mark, and the Gospel of Mark is really organized around these three people groups that Jesus talks to. He talks to the religious leaders, which he's pretty hard on at times. He talks to the crowds, which we're going to get to look at today, and then he talks to the disciples, which we'll look at in a series a little bit later in the summertime. But when Jesus would preach, thousands of people would gather around him. Sometimes upwards of tens of thousands of people would gather around him because they were so intrigued with what he had to say. But rarely would somebody actually step out of that crowd and begin to follow him with their life. A lot of the things that Jesus had to share were kind of difficult. And so when he would challenge people, of those thousands, many of them would just leave. The Gospel of John captures it really well. There was this time when Jesus was teaching some of his disciples, some of the folks who did take that little step out of the crowd. And he was teaching them, something kind of difficult, and this is what it says in John 6. It says, when many of his disciples heard it, they said, "This is a hard saying, who can listen to this?" But Jesus, knowing in himself that his disciples were grumbling about this, said to them, "Do you take offense at this?" And we know that they did take offense to it because a few verses later it says, after this, many of his disciples turned their back and no longer walked with him. So Jesus would say things that were so challenging that even some of his disciples would turn their back and walk away. Sometimes the crowds would just turn their back and walk away. Why? Because even as intriguing as he was, Jesus would share some really hard things at times. He would share some really difficult things that people could not wrap their mind around. As long as he fit their mold, as long as he fit their expectation of what he should be like, then they would hang around. And many of them would just kind of hang around because they were intrigued by what he had to say, or maybe for that free lunch that he'd pass out every once in a while, right? So these people, they would hang around, but the moment he said something challenging, they would leave. But every once in a while, you'd have somebody who would be bold enough to step out of the crowd, and forever their life would be changed. You know, crowds, they can be a good thing or a bad thing, especially when it comes to life for us. Crowds can be a good thing or a bad thing. So let me give you a couple examples here. Do you know what crowdsourcing is? Yeah, many of us know crowdsourcing, right? It's where that we, as a society, we can contribute to something much larger than ourselves, right? That maybe didn't exist before. But crowdsourcing is kind of this new idea where you can contribute to information or finances that you were never able to do before. And the internet has really changed this. And so a couple examples of this. So let me give you my first example here. So maybe if you're under like 30 years old, let me talk to you for a second, okay? So if you're under 30, when I was a kid, when many of us were kids, these strangers would come to your door and they would sell you these ancient books called encyclopedias, right? You know what I'm talking about. Encyclopedias, you probably saw them in a movie once. And each letter of the alphabet had its own volume. So you could, if you were a person of means, you could buy the entire set. You have the whole alphabet. But if you were like us growing up, you had like a couple letters, right? So it was a great idea, and you thought maybe I'll buy one every time they stop by, but 5 years down the road, you have like E and L and Q, and that's all that you have. So for me, from middle school through high school, all of my book reports started with E. So if you need to know about elephants or eardrums or electrical circuits, I got you covered. It was a good effort thinking we could get the entire set. We never did. But now that's changed. Crowdsourcing has changed that. No longer do people come to your door and try to sell you encyclopedias. Why? Because of crowdsourcing. In 2001, a website was launched called Wikipedia, right? We've all been on it. We all know it, Wikipedia. It's the largest source of information on the web. Of course, I learned that on Wikipedia, so I don't know if that's true. But it's the largest source of information where anybody at any time, can contribute to that website. And then anybody at any time can fact check what's going on and link to different things. And it has opened up an entire world of information to us that we didn't have before. So crowdsourcing has changed the way that we now receive information. And that can be good, that can be bad, right? Another great idea of crowdsourcing. In 2009, a website was launched called Kickstarter. You guys know Kickstarter? Kickstarter is a way where you can contribute financially to a project that you would have never been able to financially contribute to before. You can contribute to things like documentaries or smart technology or unique business models. You can contribute as little as $1 all the way up to tens of thousands of dollars if you want to. And all of a sudden, for a couple dollars, you can be a movie producer. You're like helping getting a movie on the stage that you would have never been able to contribute to something like that before. And in its short 8 years of existence, Kickstarter has collected and redistributed nearly $2 billion in project funds. It's changed the way that people do business. So crowds can be really good like that, and sometimes they can kind of go off the rails. Let me give you another example. In 2014, the British government, they asked for the design of a new polar research vessel. It would cost $287 million. And it would be run by the NERC, that's the Natural Environment Research something. I don't know. Anyway, it's the NERC. And it was going to be under their authority, right? And this thing would be the most technologically advanced ship on the seas for research. It was going to be the pride of the British research fleet. It'll be done sometime later this year. They're still building it right now. And because they were so proud of it, they thought, why not crowdsource it a bit, right? And so they developed a website and they developed a hashtag on Twitter to allow people to help name the boat and vote on the name. I'm laughing already. And so with the hashtag Name Our Ship, right? And all these different names started to pour in. There was this is one of the names, the Henry Worley, the RRS, the Royal Research Ship Henry Worsley. Sorry, he's a famous Arctic explorer. The RRS Poppy May. Poppy May is a little girl in the UK who has terminal cancer, and so her story got a lot of coverage, and people voted for that as well. And then there's the RRS David Attenborough. If you don't know David Attenborough, you know David Attenborough. He's the guy who narrates all those great nature films like Planet Earth. He's a naturalist and a broadcaster. But none of those won out. Do you want to know what crowdsourcing came up with? The name they came up with is this, the RRS Bodie McBoatface. Come on, that's funny. I've been laughing about that all week. The RRS Bodie McBoatface was the name that they officially gave this boat, or they tried to, right? Can you imagine being the captain of the Bodie McBoatface? Like somebody asks you what you do for a living and you're just not, well, I'm a captain. Like you wouldn't tell them. You wouldn't tell them that unless you had a really good sense of humor. A really good sense of humor. So crowdsourcing is not necessarily the best idea at times. And actually the NERC, they revoked their offer, named it the RRS David Attenborough. Good move, right? And nothing was official, so they were able to pull it back. But you see, sometimes crowdsourcing isn't the best idea, especially when it comes to our lives. But I would argue that so many of us do that with our lives. We allow the crowd to have such a loud and influential voice into our lives that we miss out on opportunities to grow and to become the women and men that God designed us to be. We allow the shout of the crowd to drown out the voice of Jesus, and essentially we become the spiritual equivalent of a Bodie McBoatface, right? We allow the crowd to tell us who we are and what we should do. Now, before we move on, I just want you all to experience this with me. It's so fun to say that name. So let's all say it together, okay? All right, ready? 1, 2, 3. Bodie McBoatface. See, you can't say it without smiling. You're all smiling. I love it. That's fantastic. But today we're going to look at someone who did throw off all those competing voices. Someone who heard those hard sayings of Jesus. And he stepped forward, stepped out of the crowd, and his life was forever changed. So if you have a Bible or if you have the notes there, we're in Mark 10, towards the end, starting in verse 46. It says this, "And they came to Jericho, and as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd," there they are, "Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, 'Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me.' And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent." Now, what's really interesting about Mark and his gospel, it's Peter's account, but Mark wrote down the details for him. And Mark is really specific with his details. He's never lazy with them. Even though it's the shortest gospel, sometimes the stories are the ones that have the most detail in them. And one really interesting detail about this story in particular is this is the only time that Mark actually names somebody that Jesus heals. Every other time, it's just the leper, or the woman, or the paralytic, or the man. They're referred to by some other way. This is the only time that he actually names the person that Jesus heals. And I think it's kind of intentional because his name is telling. His name, Bartimaeus, means worthy of honor. Worthy of honor. But here he is sitting alongside the road, and the crowd is giving him anything but honor. They're passing him by. They're telling him to shut up. We're trying to listen to Jesus. He's a beggar. He's sitting along this major route, and no doubt he's probably one of many beggars, just knowing this area. Without any kind of social systems in place, the only way that he would have survived is on the benevolence of others. That if he would have asked for help throughout the day, and people would give it to him. And this crowd, this is their town, so no doubt they've passed this man hundreds of times. And maybe they've thrown him a couple cents here and there, but they're not giving him any honor. But today was going to be different because this guy Jesus that everybody is talking about has come into town. The irony is that the central, or one of the central messages in what Jesus had to bring to us was that all of us, all of humanity, should show honor to one another. He said that the greatest thing that you can do with your life is to give it away, to love others, even those who don't love you back. He called those enemies. And he said that we're able to love others, or we're supposed to be able to love others regardless of their status, social status, economic status, political views, or theological views. We're just supposed to love and honor one another. And in the process of scrambling to try to hear what Jesus is saying about honoring one another, they trample over this guy whose name is worthy of honor. And they miss out on an opportunity to put into practice what Jesus is saying. You know, years later, a few years after Jesus walked the earth, his little brother, James, became a big deal in the church. And James warns the early church about this kind of belief. And I really like the way that the Message paraphrase of the Bible, not the translation, but this paraphrase of the Bible puts this. So this is what James has to say. It says this: don't fool yourself into thinking that you are a listener when you are anything but. Letting the word go in one ear and out the other. Act on what you hear. Those who hear and don't act are like those who glance in the mirror, walk away, and in 2 minutes, they have no idea who they are or what they look like. But whoever catches a glimpse of the revealed counsel of God, the free life, even out of the corner of his eye and sticks with it, is no distracted scatterbrain, but a man or a woman of action. That person will find delight and affirmation in the action. So anyone who sets himself up as religious, now let me pause there for a second. James is one of the few authors in the New Testament that actually uses this word religious. Don't get hung up on a modern definition of that. He just simply means the way you live out your faith. He says anyone who sets himself up as religious, the way you live out your faith, by talking a good game, is self-deceived. This kind of religion is hot air and only hot air. Real religion, the real way that you live out your faith is this. This kind that passes muster before God the Father. It's this: reach out to the homeless and the loveless in their plight, and guard against corruption from the godless world. So James is essentially saying this: what you believe should determine how you behave. Right? That we could sum that up right there. That what you believe should determine how you behave. You know, comedian Louis C.K., I know you're all fans, right? He has this quote. He says, I believe a lot of things. I don't live by any of them, but they make me feel good. That's essentially what he's saying. Right? How you believe should determine how you behave. But oftentimes we believe something and we don't live by it. It just kind of makes us feel good. I believe there's a reason why all these folks are missing this point in this crowd. I believe there's a reason why they're telling him to be quiet so that they can hear what Jesus is saying. And I think it's something that we still deal with today. They're surrounded by all these competing voices that are distracting them from this opportunity that's right in front of them. The world tries its best to crowdsource our lives, to tell us what we need to be, what we need to do. From the moment we wake up, we're spoken to. I was reading on this a little bit earlier this week, and I read a New York Times article that said that every day, each of us are exposed to nearly 5,000 advertising images in a day. Each of us. Nearly 5,000 advertising images in a day. But it's not just advertising. It's news, it's text messages, it's social media, it's friends, coaches, parents, neighbors, everybody speaking into our lives. And there are so many voices that compete for our attention. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I have a hard time stepping out of that crowd and hearing the voice of Jesus with so many other voices speaking around me. But over the years, what has really what's helped me learn to break away from this is to identify the voices. And I think there's 4 voices that really speak loudly into our lives. The first is the crowd, right? That's culture's opinions. This is the voice that Bartimaeus is dealing with right now. This crowd is telling him what to do, how to do it, and just to leave Jesus out of it. The same is true for us. From what we wear to where we live to the kind of job we pursue, the crowd is constantly trying to convince us that we need to buy this or do that. And so much of what that crowd is saying is contrary to the way that Jesus wants us to live. And that voice often lives by another name. That crowd voice, oftentimes we call it the American dream, right? We need to have a nice house, a 2-car garage with 2 cars in it, a couple kids, right? That's our idea of success. That's the way that the crowd will tell you that you are making it in this world. And those things in and of themselves are not bad, but in our pursuit of those things, oftentimes we miss opportunities to put Jesus' words into practice. And countercultural to that voice, Jesus calls us to realize that success is not about how much we can accumulate, but how much we can give away. Give away of our finances, give away of our life. The second voice is probably a familiar one. It's yours. It's your own voice in your head. It's the voice inside your head that continually brings up past experiences and past wounds, and it reminds you that you're not like other people. It's a voice that compares you to everyone else. It's the voice that says Jesus cannot love someone who has done the things that you have done. And this voice, it doesn't distract us like the crowd's voice. Instead, it tells us, just like Bartimaeus, that we're not worthy. We're not worthy to be a part of this thing, this way of following Jesus. You know, last Friday we got back from our couple-week trip to Cambodia, and honestly, last Sunday, I have no idea what I said up here. I was so tired, so lucky I didn't say something bad. But last Friday, we got back from our trip to Cambodia, the short-term team that we took. And we went over to work with our global partner, the Southeast Asia Prayer Center. We call them CPAC. And CPAC has been one of our partners for over 25 years at Northway, but we've never sent trips there until last fall. So this was our second trip. And because this is such a new partnership, there's so many unknowns to these kinds of trips. And so even a couple weeks before we were ready to leave, our team had no idea what we were doing. We had no idea what kind of projects we were going to be working on while we were there. Were we going to be building or we didn't know. We didn't know what we were doing. But about 2 weeks beforehand, we met with the founders, Mark and Ellie Geppert. And they said that they had been over there for the past 4 months, and they had been working with these 12 nationals, these 12 kids who grew up in the orphanages that CPAC oversees. And CPAC provided scholarships for them to go to college. And now that they've graduated, to pay that back, they're going to work for CPAC for a few years. And so Mark and Ellie were over there working with them, and they were partnering up with them to teach English in public schools. And so that's what they wanted us to continue. They wanted us to partner with these 12 nationals, these young 20-somethings, and go over and to teach English in public schools in rural Cambodia. Over 5,000 kids is what our small team of 6 taught over 2 weeks. That's why we were so exhausted. The project they had us on specifically was to teach pronouns. Now, I'm not good at pronouns because we didn't have the P encyclopedia when I was growing up. So I had some doubts in my head, right? But let me tell you what, every single one of our folks on our team was nervous about this project. And here's why, because none of us are teachers. None of us are teachers. We have a hairdresser, we have an accountant, we have a couple nurses, me, we don't teach, and here we're going to teach 5,000 kids in public schools. That was the project that they gave to us. And one by one, I promise you, every single one on that team, at one time or another, they expressed the idea that I am not ready for this. I am not worthy of this. I can't do this. One by one, that voice popped into our heads and said, this isn't for you. You're not good enough to do this. And I think that's probably a voice that Bartimaeus had to deal with that day too, sitting along the roadside. I think that's probably a voice that he had to deal with. I bet he thought Jesus isn't going to stop for someone like you. Bartimaeus, your name may be worthy of honor, but you're not. You're just a beggar, like all these other guys sitting around here. The third competing voice in our life is known throughout the Bible by a lot of different names, but mainly as the accuser, Satan. If you recall our fight series back in January, we talked a lot about spiritual warfare, and I'm telling you, if you didn't get a chance to catch that series, go back online and check that out because it was a fantastic series. But in that, we talked about how he aims to do 4 different things in our life. He longs for us to be filled with doubt, with fear, and hatred, but he aims for these 4 things in our life. He wants to distract us. He wants to discourage us. He wants to deceive us, and he wants to divide us. The Apostle Paul describes his actions this way. He says this, "The God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God." So one of his main roles is to keep people blind so they can't see. And I'm sure Bartimaeus had to deal with that day. He was blind in more ways than one. And I wonder if the accuser's voice was ringing loud in his ears that day, saying, Jesus can't do anything for you. Maybe even saying, Jesus is not even God in the first place. Or maybe saying, well, God is the reason why you're blind in the first place. When it comes to these voices, the crowds, self, and the enemy, when they become the ruling voices in our life, we become convinced that we're not worthy, and we miss out on opportunities to put Jesus' words into practice. We become just like this crowd, and we miss out on that chance. But Bartimaeus was not going to miss out on this chance. He was not going to miss out on it. So if we hop back into his story, in verse 48, it says this, "And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent, but he cried out all the more, 'Son of David, have mercy on me.' And Jesus stopped and said, 'Call him.' And they called the blind man, saying, 'Take heart, get up, he's calling you.' In spite of all the voices around him, Bartimaeus may have been battling, he still cried out for God that day. And when Jesus hears his cry, notice how the crowd's tone changes a bit. They turn around, they say, 'Take heart.' Now, some translations say, 'Take heart,' some say, 'Be of good cheer,' but I really like the translation, 'Take courage.' And if you were with us on Mother's Day, you know we're doing a series on Mother's Day and Father's Day called 'Take Courage.' It's that same phrase that's used right here. Take courage, get up. He's calling you. And Bartimaeus, he does just that. He realizes that he's got to put that belief that he has in his heart into practice. He realizes that what you believe should determine how you behave. What you believe should determine how you behave. And now, this is a detail that's really easy to miss. And as I mentioned, Mark is really clever in his details. He really pays attention to what's happening. He never flippantly throws around a detail. This is a reference here to the Old Testament law. This is what he says in verse 50. It says, Bartimaeus threw off his cloak and he sprang up and he came to Jesus. That is a reference from the Old Testament where it says this in Exodus 22. It says, if you ever take your neighbor's cloak and pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down. For that is his only covering, and it is his cloak and for his body. And what else shall he sleep? And if he cries to me, I'll hear him, for I am compassionate. So there's a reason why you couldn't keep someone's cloak. It was their only garment at times. It was a tremendous, significant item for them to own. And for a beggar like Bartimaeus, it was probably his only possession. He would spread it out before him and collect money that the folks gave to him. It would have been his warmth, his comfort, his means of income, his security. It would have been all that he had in life. In other words, the moment that he hears Jesus call out to him, he didn't hesitate. He didn't hold on to his cloak just in case. In spite of all those competing voices, in spite of all the unknowns, Bartimaeus left everything that he had and everything he left behind. He didn't entertain the possibility of going back to his old life. I think that's where a lot of us live, right? I think a lot of us kind of live between these two cloaks, in a sense, that we see in the New Testament. A lot of us are like the hemorrhaging woman. We want to reach out, we want to grab onto the cloak of Jesus, but we still have our hand back here on our old one. And we live between these two. But Bartimaeus wouldn't have been changed if he had held on to this one. And so it says he threw it off and he sprang up and he ran to Jesus. But I think that's where a lot of us live. A lot of us live in this idea of someday, right? Someday I'll let go of this one. Someday I'll let go of this. Someday I'll join a small group when I have time, when things clear up. Someday I'll be faithful in my giving as a regular part of my rhythm of worship like God calls us to in the Bible. Someday I'll give up this bad habit. Someday I'll volunteer in kids' church. right? We have over 80 kids over there every Sunday. We always need volunteers. Someday I'll go over there. Someday I'll follow Jesus and I'll get baptized. Someday I'll go on that short-term trip. Someday. So many of us live in this someday world where we have our hand on his cloak, but we still have our hand on the old one. In fact, I would argue that most American Christianity kind of lives in that realm, right? This mentality of someday when it comes to our faith. A relationship with Jesus is viewed oftentimes as little more than a get-out-of-hell-free card that we just kind of put away till later. And we'll pull it out when we need it. Someday. Someday I'll need this relationship with Jesus, but it doesn't really impact my life every single day, in every single action, in every single interaction that I have with the people around me. Someday I'll need him, but I don't need him today. But what if Bartimaeus had that same mentality, that same idea of, well, someday, the crowd's really thick today, so maybe next time he comes passing by, maybe then I'll cry out. Or today I'm collecting a lot, so maybe someday I'll let go of my cloak when it's a bit of a thinner day and he's going by. What if Bartimaeus had that idea of someday I'll approach Jesus, someday I'll yell out for him? Bartimaeus, his story is at the end of chapter 10. He's the last story in chapter 10. Do you know what chapter 11 is? Jesus begins marching to Jerusalem to be crucified on a cross. There is no someday. This was his last opportunity. This was it. There was no someday for Bartimaeus. Jesus is heading towards Jerusalem to be crucified. There would be no someday. But for many of us, we treat it as though, well, someday I'll be able to step forward and hear God's voice. But what if we were able to let go of that cloak? What if we were able to let go of anything that's in our past that's holding us back? And we were able to silence all those other voices and listen to the only voice that matters, and that's God's voice. God's voice that cries out to us. What if those some days we were able to ignore those? We were able to do what it says, to take courage, to get up, because he's calling us. He's calling all of us. Take courage. Get up. He's calling you. But look what happens next. Jesus says, what do you want me to do for you? That's a common question that Jesus would ask people. And he would do it intentionally. He would do it because, Bartimaeus is a beggar. Maybe he's just asking Jesus for some money. He wants Bartimaeus to take a moment and to do some self-examination. To do a little bit of self-examination. So I want us all to do a little class participation here today. Okay, so I just want you to imagine. You can do it with your eyes closed. You can just do it with your eyes open. It doesn't matter to me. I want you to imagine that Jesus is sitting right next to you right now. And he looks at you and he says, what do you want me to do for you? Think about that for a minute. What do you want me to do for you? What would you answer him? What would you say to him? Would it be to ensure that you've got your get out of hell free card? Would it be to ask for financial security for your family? If you're a teenager, maybe to make sure you got into the right school or you meet the right guy or girl that you can marry down the road? What would you ask him? I bet whatever comes to mind, he wants to do something even deeper than that. By asking this question, he forces Bartimaeus to dig deeper, to look below the surface level needs in his life. What could Jesus give him that no one else could? What can Jesus give you that no one else can? And what are you willing to let go of to get it? That's the question. So verse 51, it continues. It says this, the blind man said to him, Rabbi, let me recover my sight. And Jesus said to him, go your way, your faith has made you well. And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way. Now, first of all, don't allow the familiarity of stories like this to just wash over you. This guy was blind, and now he's not. Jesus didn't touch him. He didn't say anything special. He just instantly could see. This guy was blind, and now he's not. But that's not the only thing that changed in his world. You see, did you notice earlier in the story when it describes Bartimaeus, it says he's sitting by the roadside, right? That word roadside. Well, here at the end, again, Mark is never incidental in his details. Here at the end, he uses the word the way, that he follows him on the way. Those two are the same words. It's the Greek word hados. and it means the way. Before the followers of Jesus were called Christians, you know what they were called? They were called followers of the way. Followers of the way. If you look throughout the book of Acts, when the early church was rising up, you can see this really clearly. Here's just a few examples that we have. So in Acts 22, this is Paul, who used to imprison and kill Christians. This is him describing it. He said, I persecuted this way to death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women. And Paul hated this way so much that he hunted down and he killed Christians. But then Paul had this dramatic change, this dramatic encounter with the resurrected Jesus, and he too became a follower of the way. He says this in Acts 24. I confess to you that according to the way I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets. And when he began to share this way as a missionary that God sent him out to the town of Ephesus, it says this is what happened. About that time there arose no little disturbance concerning the way. There was a riot because of what Paul was sharing. So how did the early Christians become known as followers of the way? And what does it mean to be a follower of the way? Well, one evening before his arrest and crucifixion, Jesus gathered his closest friends and followers in the upper room to share a meal with them. And they talked about all different kinds of things around that table that evening. But mostly Jesus talked to them about the way in which he wanted them to live once he ascends back to the Father. This way is the way that we were always meant to live. It's the way that we were designed to live as men and women. And when one of his disciples, Thomas, he asked him about the way, Jesus didn't give him a bunch of rules to follow. He didn't give him a bunch of do's and don'ts saying, this is the way you live. Instead, he said this, I am the way. I'm the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. So when Mark says that Bartimaeus began to follow Jesus along the way, it's not simply saying that he walked down the road with him. It meant something much more. It meant that because of his one decision to ignore those voices and step out of the crowd, his life was forever changed for all eternity. He didn't just receive sight, he received a whole new way of living, of following after Jesus. And because of that one decision, here we are still talking about that one decision 2,000 years later. So let me put a couple decisions in front of us this morning. First, I want to talk to those who are, or maybe you're here and you're not a follower of Jesus. Maybe somebody invited you here this morning because they wanted you to experience the church that they love, right? But you're not sure about this Jesus thing. You're not sure about church. Maybe everything that we did before the sermon kind of weirded you out, right? With loud music and stuff. Maybe following after Jesus is too big of a step. Maybe you can just follow after Bartimaeus. You see, the first thing that he did was he cried out to God. He cried out to Jesus and he waited for Jesus to respond. And I will promise you this, that if you are willing to just cry out to him and see if he'll respond, I guarantee you he will. As long as you're willing to let go of that cloak. If you're willing to let go a little bit, I guarantee you he'll respond. If you're willing to let go. And so I'll say the same thing that the crowd said to Bartimaeus that day. Take courage. Be bold. Get up. He's calling you. This is an opportunity for you to step out of the crowd and become something different, to become the man or the woman that God designed you to be. And for the followers of the way in the room, the Christians, for those of us who are following after Jesus, let me ask us this question. What are you not letting go of? What cloak are you not letting go of? In what area of your life are you not following Jesus? You're still just sitting by the roadside, clinging onto your old life, and you're blind. Is it a relationship? Finances? Pride? Could be anything, but part of following the way is about going deeper. And I'll say the same thing to you that the crowd said to Bartimaeus. Take courage. Be bold in your faith. Get up. Because he's calling you. He's calling all of us. Well, let me ask another. For those of us who are followers of the way in the room this morning, where in your life are overlooked opportunities to be doers of the word and not merely hearers? Where are the overlooked opportunities in your life to put Jesus' words into practice? Who are the Bartimaeuses in your life that you're walking by every day?